What would you do if the home where you had laughed, dreamed, and believed love could protect you was suddenly taken away, and the only thing left in your hands was the person standing beside you, counting coins as though they were fragments of a life already breaking apart? By the time the sun went down that evening, the old house no longer belonged to memory, or to effort, or to the two people who had tried so hard to fill it with warmth. It belonged to the bank. The notices were real. The rooms were real. The silence after loss was painfully real. Tu Tien stood in that fading light with foreclosure papers trembling in her hands, while Jack knelt on the dusty floor, gathering loose coins as though dignity itself had scattered and rolled into the corners. There are heartbreaks that arrive like storms, loud and undeniable, and there are heartbreaks that settle slowly over a room, turning every chair, every wall, every window into proof that nothing is as safe as it once seemed. This was the second kind. No one screamed, no one collapsed, but everything inside them was already cracking. And yet, even then, love did not leave. It lowered itself to the floor. It counted the last of the money. It moved boxes in silence. It followed them into a damp rented room hidden in a narrow alley. It sat with them in the yellow light, while Jack admitted he might have to return to his mother's house for a while, and while Tu Tien, already exhausted from selling vegetables in the market, tried not to let him see how afraid she was. This was not a story about dramatic rescue. It was about two people standing in the ashes of certainty, discovering that when everything material falls away, love becomes either unbearably fragile or astonishingly strong. The evening light entered through the dusty window panes in long red streaks, staining the old house with a strange, sorrowful beauty. It was the kind of light that once might have made the rooms feel warm. That day, it made them feel haunted. Tu Tien stood motionless in the middle of the emptying space. The foreclosure notices clutched so tightly in her hands that the paper had already begun to bend beneath her fingers. She did not need to read the words again. She had read them enough. The message had long since stopped being language and become pain. This house was gone. Not tomorrow, not in theory, not if some miracle happened. It was gone now, even while the walls still stood around them and the last of their things still lay scattered across the floor. The bank had taken what love alone could not protect. Beside her, Jack was kneeling. He was gathering coins from the floor, one by one, as if refusing to waste even the smallest metal sound life had left them. The sight of him nearly broke her more than the papers had. He was not a careless man. He was not weak. He was not someone who had ever wanted to let things fall this far. And yet here he was, his back bent, his hands trembling slightly as he counted what remained, trying to turn scraps into a plan. The room felt full of fog, though there was none. That is what grief does when it enters a familiar place. It makes the air thick. It steals clarity. It makes breathing feel like work. Tu Tien looked around the house and did not see furniture, walls, and dust. She saw old mornings, shared meals, the quiet happiness of waiting for Jack to come home. She saw all the small, ordinary moments that once felt too simple to lose. Now each one came back like a shard of glass turning in the heart. Jack finally looked up at her. Worry filled his eyes, but so did an almost painful attempt at calm. He was trying to remain steady for both of them. That effort alone made her tears fall harder. Neither of them said very much. They did not need to. They were already working side by side like two exhausted people rowing through rough water with whatever strength remained in their arms. In that house, at that hour, hope and despair were no longer opposites. They existed together, tangled into one impossible knot. Tu Tien understood, perhaps more deeply than ever before, that love was no longer a source of comfort alone. It had become the rope holding them above the abyss. The new place smelled of fresh paint and damp cement, but it did not yet smell like life. When they arrived there, carrying what little they could salvage, Tu Tien's composure finally split open. she sank to the floor before the boxes were even fully set down. The room was empty except for their exhaustion, and in that emptiness, her sobs echoed without mercy. She curled into herself, shoulders shaking, face wet, the whole fear of the last few days pouring out of her at once. Material loss is one kind of pain. The terror of not knowing what comes next is another. Jack sat down beside her at once and wrapped his arms around her as tightly as he could, as if his body alone could make up for everything the world had stripped away. His voice was low and warm, but she could hear the strain in it. He whispered of plans, of temporary solutions, of getting through this one step at a time. He stroked her hair with the same care one might use to shelter a tiny flame from wind. Tu Tien pressed herself against his chest. His heartbeat was strong, but anxious. She could feel it. It told the truth his words were trying to soften. He was afraid, too. He was simply refusing to hand all of that fear to her. In that moment, the pain between them was no longer only about a house. It was about instability, exposure, the humiliation of beginning again before either of them was ready. The future outside the window felt like darkness without edges. And yet, he kept holding her. He looked into that darkness as if daring it to come closer. There was helplessness in him, yes, but also determination. Their love, in that room, did not look triumphant. It looked like a lamp trembling in hard wind, small, vulnerable, and still somehow alive. The rented room in the narrow alley was smaller still. By the time they moved into it, night had already begun training them in silence. Neon light from the street outside slipped through the cracks in the thin door and drew cold lines across the peeling walls. The air smelled of old fabric, moisture, and the sort of place that has temporarily held too many lives without ever becoming home for any of them. They arranged their few belongings without speaking much. Jack folded clothes into an old suitcase. Tu Tien straightened a corner of the bed, then set down a bowl, then adjusted a bag, as though careful order might somehow create emotional stability. At one point, his hand brushed hers by accident, and even that brief contact sent a thread of warmth through the room. It was not enough, but it was something. Tu Tien sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the dark little courtyard beyond the door. The road ahead looked thorny now, and she knew it. They had crossed from difficulty into a more exposed kind of survival. There is a loneliness that only appears after loss, when the world suddenly feels narrower, when even hope seems forced to live in temporary places. Jack sat down beside her. Shoulder to shoulder, they shared one of those silences that only deep love can bear without panic. It was not empty silence. It was a silence full of recognition. He knew she was afraid. She knew he was carrying too much. The walls around them, ugly and indifferent, became witnesses to the resilience of two people refusing to let go of each other in the middle of a storm. Later, under the dim yellow light of the old lamp on the table, Jack sat alone for a while. His phone was in his hand, but he was not dialing. He looked like a man surrounded by invisible calculations: what could be paid, what could wait, what could be endured, what could not. There are decisions that cut through hope like blades precisely because they are not cruel, only necessary. Returning for a while to his mother's house had become one of those decisions. When Tu Tien came in, he lifted his eyes to her. Even before he spoke, she knew something difficult had settled inside him. His voice was low when he finally explained. The current arrangement could not last without more help, more stability, more breathing room. Going back to his mother's house for a time might ease some of the pressure, allow him to manage expenses, regroup, and keep them from sinking further. Rain had started outside. It tapped softly against the roof and the alley walls, blending with the sound of their breathing. Tu Tien listened, her eyes reddening again, though this time she fought harder to stay composed. She wanted to understand, and she did. But understanding does not always reduce pain. Sometimes it only dignifies it. Jack took her hand. He told her it would only be temporary. He said it as much for her as for himself. His heart was chaos in that moment. Duty, shame, practicality, love, everything had tangled inside him until there was no clean edge between one feeling and the next. Yet once the decision was spoken aloud, it no longer hovered as an unnamed dread. It became one more test. And like every other test life had already given them, they faced it together. The mornings that followed were not dramatic. That was what made them so hard. Mist still lay low over the fields when Tu Tien bent to pick vegetables. Each leaf that fell into her basket felt less like produce and more like a tiny wager against defeat. She took them to market, called out to customers, stood in the heat, smiled through sweat, accepted too little money, returned with too little relief. At home, Jack sat before the old desk, making columns of numbers that refused to obey him. He recalculated, reconsidered, rearranged. But no matter how many times he tried, the figures would not turn into comfort. Money has a cruelty of its own. It can make a man feel as though every decision is both necessary and insufficient. When Tu Tien returned from the market, there was usually not much to say. A tired smile, a few bills, a simple meal. Their hardship became woven into ordinary gestures. She placed the money down. He looked at it too carefully. They ate in silence more than once, not because love had weakened, but because both of them were using their strength simply to remain upright. Still, they kept choosing one another. She felt the fatigue in every step. He carried pressure on his shoulders like invisible stone, and yet they guarded the small flame between them, the one thing they had left that no bank could seize. Dusk became their gentlest hour. When Tu Tien returned to the room after a long day, her legs ached, dust clung to her clothes, and exhaustion sat over her like another layer of skin. Jack would rise when he saw her. That mattered. He would look at her, and in that look alone, some of the room's loneliness would dissolve. They sat together in the dim yellow light. Sometimes she told him a little about the market. Sometimes he said very little at all and simply listened. His hand would close over hers and hold it with the quiet insistence of someone trying to transfer strength without speaking the attempt aloud. In that space between day and night, fatigue and hope would intertwine again, not beautifully, but honestly. The end of a hard day is not always rest. Sometimes it is only the return to the person who saw how hard you tried. And then one evening, in that same cramped room they had reluctantly begun calling home, something softened. The light seemed warmer. The air, though still narrow and worn, held a different kind of stillness. Tu Tien leaned into Jack, and he drew her fully into his arms. Her ear rested against his chest. His heartbeat, no longer racing against the day, sounded almost peaceful. For the first time in a while, both of them smiled without effort. Financial trouble had not disappeared. The uncertainty about his mother's house remained. The rented room was still small, still temporary, still marked by everything they had lost. But for that moment, in that embrace, the world loosened its grip. Jack kissed her forehead gently. He whispered love against her skin, not in grand declarations, but in the kind of words that only matter because they are spoken after suffering has already stripped people of everything false. Tu Tien held him tighter in return, and tears came again, this time not from fresh sorrow, but from the strange relief of finding warmth still possible after so much despair. Their embrace became more than comfort. It became proof that closeness can survive foreclosure, proof that tenderness can survive humiliation, proof that when life takes away rooms, furniture, certainty, and future plans, it cannot necessarily take away the one human being who has chosen to remain beside you through the unraveling. Outside, the alley remained dim, indifferent, ordinary. Inside, in that tiny room, love became a fire just strong enough to heat the cold. The future was still uncertain, No miracle had arrived, no debt had vanished, no larger rescue stood waiting just outside the door. But perhaps that was exactly what made their hope real. It was not built on luck. It was not built on fantasy. It was built on two wounded people who had already seen what collapse looked like and still chose, night after night, to believe in each other. And maybe that is the hardest, purest truth of love. Sometimes it does not save you from the storm. Sometimes it becomes the shelter you build inside it.